Welcome to Crimson Legacy Historians, where the past is not just remembered, but brought back to life with depth and clarity. 80 ad, the Roman Colosseum, 50 zeros, 0 people screaming. In the center of the arena, a woman chained to a wooden structure. Naked, terrified, suddenly they release a bull, not to kill her, for something worse. The guards have built a mechanical replica of a cow. They shove the woman inside and force the bull to mount her. It's an execution, but disguised as the myth of Pasiphae, the queen who had sex with a bull. The crowd applauds, children watch, senators laugh. Welcome to Roman entertainment. This isn't fiction, it really happened. The poet's marshal was there at the Colosseum's inauguration, and he wrote it down. We saw Pasiphae joined to the bull. The ancient legend received testimony under Caesar. Rome, the greatest empire in history. Laws, aqueducts, philosophy, and this public rape turned into family entertainment. Today, you're going to discover the most brutal, most perverted, most inhuman spectacles that Rome organized in the arena. Things Hollywood would never show, that your teachers never mentioned, but that the Romans documented in detail, because this wasn't madness. It was politics, propaganda, control, and it was completely legal. I'm Crown and Dagger, and here there's no censorship, only the truth Rome prefers you forget. Notice how when they talk about the Colosseum, they always mention heroic gladiators, but they never tell you this. Every week, Crown and Dagger unears the most disturbing stories the world prefers to ignore. If you want unfiltered history, hit like and subscribe, because what comes next is much more brutal. Rome, 1st to 4th century AD, 60 million people, the largest empire in human history, and every major city had one thing in common, an arena. Over 250 amphitheaters across Roman territory. The Colosseum held 50,000 spectators, and it was packed almost daily. Here's what you need to understand. This wasn't random violence, it was industrial. Cal death. The historian Atropius calculated that over 400,000 people died in Roman arenas across 4 centuries. That's an entire city erased for entertainment. At the Colosseum's inauguration, Emperor Titus celebrated with 100 consecutive days of games, 9,000 animals slaughtered. That's 90 deaths per day for fun. Emperor Trajan, after conquering 123 days of games, 10,000 gladiators. Thousands of prisoners executed. The philosopher Seneca attended these games and wrote something chilling. I come home more greedy, more cruel, more inhuman because I have been among humans. He watched the midday executions, criminals tied to stakes, lions released, the crowd betting on how long each victim would scream before dying. That was lunch entertainment. Why? Because the arena did something no other institution could. It taught obedience through pleasure. When you watch a man torn apart, you learn what happens to Rome's enemies. When you cheer as someone dies, you become complicit, and that complicity was the point. According to historian Cassius Dio, Rome spent more on arena entertainment than on roads, schools, or hospitals. By the 2nd century AD, they had supply chains bringing lions from Africa, criminals from Gaul, Christians from Judea. It was bureaucratic, scheduled, budgeted, death packaged as entertainment, delivered daily to a population addicted to brutality. What you just heard, that was the system. Now, let me show you what actually happened in that sand. The spectacles that made 50,000 people cheer while humanity died in front of them, starting with how it all began at a funeral with blood. 264 BC. 3 sons wanted to honor their dead father, not with prayers, but with blood. They armed 3 pairs of slaves and forced them to fight to the death in the Fororum, a cattle market reeking of dung and smoke. This wasn't entertainment, it was munus, a duty owed to the dead. The practice came from Rome's enemies, the Campanians and Samnites. They believed restless spirits needed blood to find peace, but Roman elites saw something else: power. A funeral with bloodshed proved wealth. A funeral with spectacular bloodshed proved dominance. By the 3rd century BC, Politicians were using funeral games as campaign tools. The Senate called it piety. The crowd knew it was politics. Even the armor told stories. The Sam Knight's gladiator wore gear mimicking Rome's conquered enemies. Every slash was a replay of Roman victories. Death became propaganda. Temporary wooden stands gave way to permanent amphitheaters, temples to violence where death whispered the same message. Rome commands men, armies, even death itself. If funeral games were how it started, what came next turned the arena into Rome's cruelest spectacle. Because Rome discovered something, exotic suffering sells better than ordinary death. Lions from North Africa, leopards from the Caucasus, crocodiles from the Nile, giraffes dragged across deserts. They weren't displayed as wonders. They were condemned as prey in a carnival of slaughter. Romans called these shows venenesses, hunts, but they weren't hunts. They were executions of nature itself. Julius Caesar set the tone in 46 BC, parading a giraffe, the first ever seen in Europe. They called it a camelipardilus because Rome had no word for it. It didn't matter. The animal was thrown into the sand to be torn apart. The message, if Rome could seize the strangest beasts alive, it could conquer anything. The slaughter exploded. At the Colosseum's inauguration, Emperor Titus oversaw the deaths of more than 9,000 animals in one festival. Archaeologists found bones etched with deliberate starvation marks. Lions and bears were weakened beforehand to ensure a quick, bloody kill. Behind the scenes, logistics were brutal. Caravans dragged cages through scorching deserts. Fleets floated them down the Nile. Handlers risked their lives delivering living trophies to a city that demanded fresh blood with every sunrise. Pliny the Elder warned that rare species were vanishing from their homelands. Lions, leopards, elephants pushed toward extinction. The Colosseum wasn't just a theater of death, it was an ecological wrecking ball. Animal massacres drew crowds, but Rome wanted more. They wanted suspense, imbalance, fights where the outcome was rigged, but the suffering was real. They wanted theater disguised as combat. When you picture a gladiator, you imagine two evenly matched warriors. The reality was twisted. Rome thrived on imbalance, contests engineered for cruelty. Prisoners and criminals were shoved into the arena, dressed as clowns, handed wooden swords, and sent to die against seasoned killers. The crowd jeered as the doomed flailed and fell. Public execution disguised as sport. The weapons became characters. The Retiarius fought with a fisherman's net and trident against the secular, whose helmet was designed to deflect the net. It wasn't skill. It was suspense. Would the net ensnare, or would the sword break through? Sometimes one gladiator faced multiple foes. Other times, entire units clashed, turning the arena into a swamp of blood and mangled corpses. The helmets were weapons of torment. Some narrowed vision, forcing fighters to stumble half-blind while the audience roared with laughter. Others were so heavy that raising one's head became agony. Armor wasn't protection, it was punishment. Gladiators dressed as barbarians, forced to mimic Rome's defeated enemies. Their inevitable loss reminded everyone the empire always prevails. Mismatched combat was cruel, but it wasn't the worst because Rome had a special category of victims, people who weren't meant to fight. They were meant to die screaming while the crowd laughed. By midday, combat gave way to theater with death at center stage. Romans called it damnatio ad bestas, condemnation to the beasts, criminals, deserters, slaves, prisoners of war. They became unwilling actors in executions disguised as myth. Each punishment matched the crime. Thieves torn apart by wolves, arsonists burned alive, traitors thrown to lions. Every scene was a morality play written in real blood. Lions were starved to a frenzy before release. Bears chained in pits were goaded into fury. The uncertainty, would the beast strike fast or toy with its prey, kept the stands howling for more. During Emperor Trajan's celebrations after conquering Dia, thousands of captives were slaughtered over 123 days. It wasn't random, it was organized, pace-like acts in a drama, every death crafted to keep the audience on edge. The historian Strauss recorded victims tied to stakes with wild bulls released. The BS trained to attack movement would gore prisoners while the crowd placed bets on how long each victim would scream. This wasn't justice, it was entertainment with a moral veneer. Pause for a second. 4 spectacles in, thousands dead, species extinct, humans turned into props. And if you think this is the worst Rome did, you're wrong, because what comes next is where execution stopped being about death and became pure sadistic theater. For the condemned, it wasn't enough to die. They had to perform their demise, acting out Rome's myths with their own bodies. Prisoners forced to play doomed heroes, Orpheus, the musician who tamed beasts. In myth, animals sat enchanted. In the arena, a bear was released mid-performance and mauled the singer to death. The poet Martial witnessed this. We saw Orpheus. If he delayed, the beasts would have obeyed, but he was torn apart. Another victim forced to play Daedalus, suspended on crude wings, he soared briefly before plunging to the beasts below. Martial quipped, the man must have wished for real feathers. The most grotesque Pasiphae and the bull. One show staged her union with a mechanical beast, followed by a mauling that blurred execution, humiliation, and pornography. Tertullian recorded that female prisoners were sometimes dressed as priestesses and violated in front of the crowd before being killed. The message: Rome owned its myths just as it owned its people. Heroes, villains, kings, queens, none were safe from being rewritten as props in a pageant of death. For spectators, sideshows; for the condemned, agonizing ends dressed in costumes. For Rome, propaganda made flesh. Everything so far happened on land in a normal arena, but Rome wasn't satisfied. They asked, what if we flooded the arena? What if we brought the ocean to the desert and made men die at sea? Mock naval battles, Namakir, were spectacles on an insane scale where water itself became a weapon. Julius Caesar in 46 BC dug an enormous basin near the Tiber, filled it with water and ships. Thousands of captives shoved aboard, told to fight as rival fleets. They weren't actors, they were men condemned to die for applause. Arrows, catapults, steel, a slaughterhouse afloat. Augustus expanded it. In 2 BC, he created a basin almost 2 zeros, 0 by 1, 200 FT, fed by a custom aqueduct just to keep it full. 30 warships clashed, crammed with prisoners, fated never to leave alive. The message: Rome could command seas where none existed. Even nature bent to imperial whim. By 52 AD, Claudius drained Lake Fusina for another in Machia. When captives greeted him with mortuary to salutant, those who are about to die salute you, history gained one of its most haunting lines. Even the Colosseum had channels to flood for naval shows, then drain for combat the next day. Cruelty became an engineering project. The arena never stopped innovating, and as the empire aged, the spectacles grew more depraved. Here's where Rome crossed every remaining line, women forced to fight, sometimes naked, sometimes against dwarfs or animals. The sadist juvenile mocked them, yet records proved they fought for real. Their presence blurred gender lines, but reinforced a darker truth. No one was beyond Rome's hunger for spectacle. Prisoners dressed in pitch-soaked shirts and set ablaze. Tertullian bitterly wrote they were living torches. These weren't executions, they were warnings carved into living flesh. Men and women writhing as smoke curled into the sky while vendors howled wine and children played nearby. Borrowed from the east, staged inside the arena. Men and women nailed to timber while the crowd ate lunch. Death wasn't quick. It took hours, sometimes days, and the audience watched it all. Emperors became gladiators. Commodus, the ultimate showman, stormed into the Colosseum dressed as Hercules, slaughtering hundreds of animals crippled beforehand. He fought gladiators too, but only with every advantage rigged. Losing was impossible. Clapping was compulsory. According to historian Cassius Dio, Commiatus fought as a gladiator 735 times. Each victory cost the treasury 1,000,000 sisters. Christians who refused to renounce their faith were thrown to lions, burned alive, or crucified as mass entertainment. Their deaths twisted into crowd-pleasing shows. These weren't executions. They were public relations campaigns against any ideology that challenged Rome's supremacy. We've covered 11 spectacles, hundreds of thousands dead. Which one was the most depraved? The mythological executions where people acted out their own deaths, the living torches, the naval battles. Drop your answer in the comments, because I want to know at what point does entertainment become evil. So what happened after centuries of this? By the late Empire, Rome spent more on arena games than on its military, more on spectacles than on infrastructure. Not everyone cheered. Seneca confessed the executions hardened him. I come home more greedy, more cruel, more inhuman because I have been among humans. Violence seeped past the arena walls, poisoning daily life. For Christians, the amphitheater was persecution and proof. Tertullian called the shows seeds of cruelty, indicting an empire that cheered injustice as sport. Economically, the games devoured fortunes. Rulers bankrupted themselves, chasing spectacles grand enough to outshine predecessors. Culturally, the appetite dulled Rome's edge. Citizens who once honored discipline now demanded cheap bread and endless circuses. Juvenal mocked this with panem essence. The craving for spectacle betrayed how far Rome had drifted from its roots. As frontiers cracked and funds dried, the arenas crumbled. By the 5th century, the Colosseum stood hollow, its sand silent, its roars gone. The moral question, could a society that trained its people to revel in suffering truly endure? History says no. If this story made your stomach turn, but you can't stop listening, hit like now. Because it means these unfiltered stories are what you really want. And if you want me to investigate more grotesque secrets that books hide, subscribe because every week there's a new historical nightmare. Today the Colosseum looms, scarred but proud. Walk its tunnels and you might hear echoes, iron clashing, beasts roaring, 50, 0, 0, 0 voices rising as one.